The blue and red lights appeared without warning, without a siren, without even the courtesy of a PA announcement, just the sudden violent eruption of strobing color in the rearview mirror that turned the inside of the Honda into a pulsing theater of blue and white. And Marcus Webb's hands were already moving to 10 and 2 before his brain had fully processed what was happening behind him, because 14 years of training had built reflexes that didn't wait for conscious thought. He checked the speedometer, first 51 and a 55, then the headlights on, then the registration sticker on the windshield current through November, then the mirrors in a sweep that went left center right in under 2 seconds. The kind of scan that had nothing to do with civilian driving habits and everything to do with a career spent reading environments for threats before they announced themselves. Beside him, Dr. Diane Webb straightened in her passenger seat, blinking away the haze of near sleep, her head coming up from where it had been resting against the window, and she didn't say anything because she didn't need to. She looked at the lights in the side mirror, looked at Marcus, and her hands moved to her lap, palms up visible, the practiced gesture of a woman who had learned this before she learned to drive. Route 19 stretched ahead of them in the headlights, 2 lanes of Tennessee asphalt cutting through farmland and absolute darkness. No streetlights, no businesses, no witnesses except the occasional pair of headlights approaching from the opposite direction and disappearing back into the night, and the gravel shoulder where Marcus eased the Honda to a stop crunched under the tires with a sound that seemed very loud in the sudden quiet after he cut the engine. A black couple, a dark Honda, a rural 2-lane road with nothing for miles in either direction, and behind them a deputy who had not yet stepped out of his cruiser, who was sitting in the glow of his laptop running their plates, who had absolutely no idea what was sitting in that car, and in about 35 minutes his entire department was going to find out. Marcus Webb was not introduced to this highway as a hero. He came to it as a tired man with a case file that was almost complete and a Saturday night routine that had become over 6 months. Something close to a second job that paid nothing except the slow accumulation of evidence that he hoped would one day mean something to 312 people who had never met him. He had grown up in Memphis in a neighborhood where the relationship between the community and the police department was complicated in the way that things are complicated when one side has most of the power and the other side has most of the consequences. And he had watched that dynamic from his front porch for 18 years before he made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him, which was to fight it from the inside rather than around it. To become the thing he most needed to exist and most feared would never be what it was supposed to be. 14 years with the FBI, the last 5 assigned to the Civil Rights Division out of the Memphis field office, and the current assignment was Operation Clear Road, 6 months of Saturday night drives on Route 19 in Harlan County, Tennessee. Not random, not recreational, but methodical data collection that built week by week into a case file that sat in a secure server in Memphis and grew thicker every time Marcus drove home with another timestamp, another badge number, another incident logged. The number was 312. 312 documented traffic stops on this highway over the past 18 months, pulled from county records, cross-referenced against federal databases, analyzed by a team of 3 analysts who had spent 4 months building the statistical portrait of what was happening on this road, and what they found was that 87% of those stops involved Black or Latino drivers, that the stops produced almost no meaningful difference in actual contraband recovery compared to the general population, and that 4 drivers had been physically harmed during encounters that were officially listed as routine. The case file was almost complete, which meant tonight was supposed to be one more uneventful drive, one more Saturday night on Route 19 that produced no stop, no incident. Just the continued documentation of a highway where Marcus had been driving for half a year and never been pulled over right up until the moment he was, and the careful architecture of 6 months of patient work suddenly became very personal, very fast. One sentence about Diane, because she deserves more than one sentence. But this is where the story is going to have to make a promise it intends to keep. She had known what these drives were. From the first month had agreed to be in the car without being asked twice, had never once suggested he stop. But she had also never pretended, not to herself and not to him, that agreeing to something and not being afraid of it were the same thing. Diane Webb was not a passenger in any meaningful sense of the word, and anyone who looked at her sitting quietly in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and mistook the stillness for passivity was making the same mistake that a lot of people made about surgeons, which was confusing the absence of panic with the absence of feeling. She had been on her feet for 18 hours before she got into that car, 2 emergency surgeries back to back, and then a colleague's retirement dinner in Shelbyville that she had attended in her good Navy dress, the one she kept in her office for exactly these occasions, still carrying the faint antiseptic smell of the OR underneath her perfume because there hadn't been time to go home and change, and by the time Marcus picked her up at 9 o'clock, she was the kind of tired that settled into bone and posture rather than just eyelids. Her father, Raymond Laurent, had spent 28 years as a Chicago PD officer, walking beats in neighborhoods that tested everything a person thought they believed about justice and human nature, and he had raised his daughter with a knowledge that very few children receive directly from a parent, the knowledge that the badge was supposed to mean protection, that it was supposed to be the thing standing between ordinary people and harm, and also the knowledge of what it looked like, felt like, and cost people when it wasn't, when the badge became the source of the harm instead of the shield against it. That knowledge was sitting in her chest right now in the dark. Not as fear exactly, but as a very specific kind of readiness. The readiness of a woman who had watched her father come home from difficult shifts and heard him talk about the moments where good officers and bad ones made choices, and who had spent 20 years in medicine learning that the difference between those who helped and those who hurt was almost always a decision, not a circumstance. She was calm, not because she wasn't afraid, because she was the particular fear of a black woman on a dark highway in rural Tennessee who understood that a traffic stop is never just a traffic stop, but because her father had told her when she was 16 years old that if this moment ever came, the most important thing she could do was stay present, stay observant, and stay alive and fight everything else later. Craig Fulton was not introduced to this story as a monster because the truth is more uncomfortable than that he was a man who had never been stopped, not once in 16 years, not by his department, not by his sergeant, not by the union, not by any of the 23 people who had filed complaints against him and watched those complaints disappear into the administrative machinery of a county sheriff's office that protected its own with the thoroughness of an institution that had confused loyalty with complicity for so long that it no longer knew the difference. He was 38 years old and had been with the Harlan County Sheriff's Office for 16 of those years, and in that time he had developed what he called instincts, which was the word he used when he wanted to describe his ability to look at a vehicle on a dark road and decide before he had any actual information whether the driver deserved his attention. And the instincts were not instincts in any meaningful sense of the word. They were a set of assumptions that had never been challenged, applied to people who had never had the power to challenge them. 23 complaints, all dismissed, some quickly, some after brief internal reviews that concluded with language like officer acted within the scope of his duties or insufficient evidence to support disciplinary action, which meant that 23 people had taken the significant personal risk of filing a formal complaint against a law enforcement officer in a county where that officer knew everyone in the department, and every single one of those people had ended up with nothing to show for it, except the knowledge that the system they had appealed to had looked at what Craig Fulton did and decided it was fine. Tonight, Sergeant Karen Doyle had mentioned to him at shift briefing that a dark Honda had been running Route 19 for weeks, same time, same direction, and that Sheriff Tanner had noticed the pattern and wanted it looked into, which was all the instruction Fulton needed, because in 16 years he had learned that when the sheriff said look into it, the department's job was to find something, and if something wasn't there, to be creative about the looking. He spotted the Honda at 9:04 p.m. and turned on his lights without thinking about it very hard. The way a man does something he has done so many times, it no longer requires deliberation. The 93 seconds between the moment Fulton's lights came on and the moment his car door opened were not accidental. They were part of the technique, the deliberate extension of the weight that let anxiety build in the vehicle ahead, that made the driver wonder what was coming, that used anticipation as a form of control before a single word had been spoken or a single order given. Marcus used the time because 14 years had taught him that anxiety in a traffic stop was a choice, and documentation was a better use of 93 seconds. He confirmed his speed, 51 in a 55, confirmed the registration sticker, confirmed the headlights were on, and confirmed that both his hands were visible on the wheel before Fulton had even opened his door, which meant that when the record of this night was eventually assembled, the very first thing documented would be a driver doing everything correctly. Diane placed her hands palms up on her lap without being asked, not because anyone had told her to tonight, but because her father had told her to when she was 15, sitting at the kitchen table in Chicago while he explained in the careful voice he used for things that mattered, that visible hands were the difference between a police officer who felt in control of a situation and one who didn't, and that her job in a traffic stop was to reduce the number of ways the interaction could become something worse. The flashlight hit Marcus's eyes before Fulton reached the window, not a quick sweep of the interior to check for weapons or passengers, but a sustained, deliberate beam held directly at his face, the kind of light that turned the windshield into a wall of white and made the deputy approaching from behind. Invisible, and Marcus recognized it immediately for what it was, not a safety procedure, but a dominance signal, a way of establishing before the first word who held the power in this conversation. The first words out of Craig Fulton's mouth were not good evening, and they were not license and registration. They were a command delivered in the flat, stripped-down register of a man who didn't feel the need to perform courtesy for the kind of driver he had already decided he was dealing with. And they were the first entry in a case file that was going to be very long before the night was over. Marcus narrated his own movements aloud as he reached for the door handle. "I'm going to reach for the door with my left hand. I'm opening the door now." Not because the narration was legally required, not because he expected it to change what was about to happen, but because 14 years in federal law enforcement had taught him that the record of a night like this was built in the details, and every detail spoken aloud into the open air of a rural highway at 9:07 on a Saturday night was a detail that could not later be revised. Fulton's body camera was visible on his chest. Marcus clocked it in the first 2 seconds outside the car, noted the green standby light that confirmed the device was powered on, and noted the red recording light that was not blinking, which meant the camera had been deliberately kept in standby mode, a conscious decision made before Fulton ever got out of his cruiser. The kind of decision that preceded things a deputy didn't want documented, and that Marcus had seen referenced in 8 separate Operation Clear Road case files. He asked for the reason for the stop twice calmly using precise language. "Officer, may I ask the reason for this stop?" And then after no answer, "I'd like to understand the legal basis for this detention." And both times, Fulton responded not with information, but with escalation. The second request, producing a flashlight, swung close enough to Marcus's face that the metal rim nearly grazed his cheek, a gesture designed to communicate that the question itself was an impertinence. The ankle kick came when Marcus was spread against the hood, Fulton's boot against his right ankle, widening his stance another 6 inches beyond where it already was, not gently, not with the measured force of an officer maintaining control of a situation, but with the casual contempt of a man who had learned that small violences were invisible on paper, that a bruise on an ankle bone didn't survive a departmental review as evidence of anything except an officer doing his job, and Marcus absorbed it and filed it in the growing mental ledger of this night. The drug trafficking alert came out smooth and practiced the vague description the statute citation delivered from memory, and Marcus processed it immediately. The description was so broad as to be meaningless, the alert almost certainly fabricated, and the ease with which Fulton produced the legal language confirmed that this was not improvisation, but a rehearsed script, the performance of a man who had played this particular scene many times and knew exactly how it was supposed to end. Fulton ordered Marcus to the hood, hands flat, spread your feet, and walk to the rear of the vehicle alone, which was not an accident because the geometry of the trunk search placed Marcus's back to the action, and Diane's sightline blocked by the open passenger door and the angle of the patrol car's spotlight, and the design of the situation, intentional or learned through repetition, gave Fulton approximately 40 seconds of unsupervised access to the rear compartment of a vehicle belonging to two people he had already decided were guilty of something. Marcus heard the trunk latch release, heard the hydraulic arm hiss as the lid rose, heard the suitcase being unzipped and rifled through with the particular carelessness of a man handling evidence rather than someone else's. Belongings heard. Diane's box of medical journals hit the road shoulder when it was removed and tossed aside, and then heard something that he had read about in 4 separate witness statements from Operation Clear Road, but had never personally experienced a soft crinkle of plastic brief, almost inaudible beneath the ambient sound of the highway, the sound of a small bag being introduced to a space that hadn't contained it 30 seconds earlier. When Fulton returned to the driver's side, he was holding a small Ziploc bag between his thumb and index finger, his flashlight angled to illuminate the contents, and he held it the way a man holds something he wants you to believe he found rather than something he brought with him, which was a distinction that the entire architecture of tonight's case was going to rest on. Want to explain this, and Marcus looked at the bag without turning, his body hands still on the hood, and said what was true, that the bag was not in the vehicle when they left Shelbyville, that the spare tire compartment had been accessed unsupervised, and that he wanted it noted for any recording devices currently active that the contraband had been introduced during a period of unsupervised access to the rear of his vehicle. The handcuffs went on at 2 clicks tighter than necessary. Not a small thing, because the ratchet mechanism on standard issue restraints allowed for very precise calibration, and 2 extra clicks was a choice, not an accident. The metal edge biting into the base of Marcus's palms and beginning immediately to restrict circulation, and Fulton leaned close enough to deliver the statute citation in a voice that smelled of wintergreen dip and the particular confidence of a man who had done this 100 times without consequence. Diane watched Fulton approach her window from the passenger side and understood in the first 3 seconds before he spoke, before he touched the flashlight to the glass, what kind of interaction this was going to be. Not because she was prescient, but because she was her father's daughter, and her father had described this exact posture, this exact approach, this specific quality of entitled authority worn on the face of a man who had decided before he arrived that the outcome was already settled. The thin, performative courtesy lasted approximately 45 seconds, "Evening, ma'am." And then the flashlight dropped to her surgical bag on the floor of the passenger seat, and the courtesy evaporated entirely, replaced by the flat, demanding register that Fulton apparently reserved for people he had already decided didn't deserve the performance. And when he told her to open the bag, she did not open it, not because she was defiant for the sake of it, but because she was a surgeon who spent her professional life making decisions based on information rather than instruction, and she had not been given a single piece of actual information about why she was sitting on the shoulder of a Tennessee highway at 9 in the evening, being treated like a suspect. When Fulton grabbed her forearm and pulled her from the car, the motion was designed to be overwhelming fast, forceful. No warning. The kind of physical intervention that worked on people whose nervous systems defaulted to compliance under sudden physical pressure. And Diane stumbled when her feet hit the gravel because she had been seated and was being moved faster than the transition from seated to standing would normally allow. And she caught herself on the open door and felt the gravel under her shoes and heard her surgical bag spill onto the ground behind her, instruments clattering against each other inside the padded case. Her father's voice arrived in her head without invitation, the way it always did when something important was happening. She was 12 years old and sitting on the back porch in Chicago, and he was telling her in the voice he used for things that needed to be remembered, that the badge was supposed to protect her, and that on the days it didn't, her job was to stay alive and document everything and fight everything else from a position of safety, and she heard it the way she had heard it at 12 clearly and without distortion, and she took a breath. The handcuffs went on the same way they had gone on Marcus. Too tight metal edge, deliberate, the message delivered in hardware rather than words, and when she looked across the roof of the car at him, 12 years of marriage compressed into a single glance, she communicated 3 things simultaneously. I'm here. I trust the plan, but the plan had better be worth what this is costing. And Marcus looked back at her, and she could see that he understood all three. Sandra Pruitt's voice came through the patrol car's radio at 9:22 p.m. with the smooth, flat professionalism of a woman who had been sitting behind a dispatch console for 20 years and had learned to deliver any information, accurate or otherwise, in exactly the same tone, so that the tone itself became a form of authority. The alert. She provided a reference number, an issuing agency. A case number was complete. Detailed and entirely fabricated, and Marcus knew this immediately because the alert numbering sequence for the Middle Tennessee region had reached 287 as of Friday's intelligence briefing, and the number Pruitt cited was 314, which meant either that 27 new alerts had been issued in the last 36 hours without being uploaded to the Federal Shared Database, or that the number had been invented in the last 90 seconds by a dispatcher who had done this before and knew exactly how to make it sound real. Sergeant Karen Doyle arrived at 9:30 p.m. in a department SUV that she parked at an aggressive angle behind Fulton's cruiser, adding another layer of emergency lights to the display that was now visible from a quarter mile in both directions, and she assessed the scene with the particular warmth of a woman whose empathy was entirely strategic. Soft voice, the slight tilt of concern in the head, the maternal register that was designed to communicate. "I'm the reasonable one, work with me," while her eyes were doing something much colder behind it. The separation order came quickly. Marcus in Fulton's car, Diane in Doyle's, and it was phrased as logistics, as a matter of transport capacity. But it was control the removal of the one person who could independently corroborate either of their accounts from the other person who would be constructing that account, and Marcus knew it, and Diane knew it, and Doyle knew they knew it, and issued the order anyway, because knowing what a tactic is doesn't make it less effective. Diane looked at Marcus through the car window as the doors were about to close, and she gave him the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, the kind of signal that only made sense in the context of 12 years, and it meant do what you need to do, which was also the most expensive thing she had ever said to him, though neither of them knew that yet. The back seat of Fulton's cruiser smelled like fast food grease and industrial cleaner, and the faint chemical residue of pepper spray that had been used at some point in this vehicle's history and never fully dissipated. And Marcus sat in the plastic cage of it, with his hands cuffed behind him and his wrists already beginning to numb and his mind working the way it worked in operational situations, which was to say clearly and in sequence, starting with the most important information and building outward. He recited quietly, just above a whisper into the empty space of the back seat, the time of the initial stop, the statutory basis claimed, the body camera status confirmed, inactive, the ankle contact, the trunk search, the planted evidence, the handcuff application, the radio call, Doyle's arrival, the separation order. Every violation in sequence time-stamped against the Casio digital on his wrist, a watch he wore specifically because its atomic clock synchronization meant that every time he gave in a courtroom would be within 1 second of accurate. Fulton was talking in the front seat, talking to himself more than to Marcus, the satisfied monologue of a man running through his own performance and finding it impressive, and Marcus did not respond, did not engage, did not give him anything that could be used, because the specific cruelty Fulton was performing right now, the commentary about consultants, about nice cars, about what he thought he knew was less important than the information Marcus was building in his head, which was going to outlast Craig Fulton's Saturday night smugness by about 14 years minimum. The credential case was still in his jacket. Nobody had patted him down, not at the roadside, and not during the brief moment of processing at the cruiser, because Fulton had been so focused on the performance of the vehicle search and the planted evidence that he had neglected the fundamental procedure of searching the person he was arresting, which was the kind of mistake that only happened when a deputy was more interested in the theater of authority than the actual mechanics of law enforcement. 5 ounces of metal and leather pressed against his ribs, the gold badge and the laminated ID of a supervisory special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And Marcus made the decision again consciously and deliberately, the same decision he had been making for 6 months. Not yet, because 312 people deserve better than one bad night ending quietly. The doors of Doyle's SUV closed and the highway disappeared behind the tinted glass, and Diane was alone with a woman who had spent the last 15 minutes performing the role of the reasonable officer, the one who understood that this was stressful, the one who wanted to help, and in the privacy of the SUV's interior with no one watching and no camera recording. Doyle dropped the performance almost immediately, the way an actress drops a character the moment the director calls cut. She drove without speaking for the first 3 minutes, which Diane spent cataloging her own physical state. The bruising she could already feel forming on her forearm, where Fulton had gripped her during the extraction. The abrasion on her right wrist from the cuff's metal edge. The way her right shoulder was stiff from the motion of being pulled from the seat. The surgeon's automatic inventory, the habit of assessment that didn't turn off just because the patient was herself. When Diane asked for her phone call, calmly citing Tennessee. Code annotated the correct section and chapter from memory, the way she cited drug interaction data in emergency situations, because precision was the only tool she had right now. Doyle's response was an open-handed slap across the left side of her face, hard enough that Diane tasted blood where her cheek connected with her own teeth, delivered without escalation, without anger visible in Doyle's expression, without any indication that what she had just done was anything other than a routine procedure. The silence after the blow was worse than the blow itself. The specific silence of a woman who had just done something violent and felt no need to justify or explain it. And Diane sat with the blood in her mouth and her ears ringing slightly, and understood, with the particular clarity that shock sometimes produced, that the casualness of what had just happened was the most important thing about it. Karen Doyle had not hit her in a moment of rage or panic. She had hit her in a moment of mild inconvenience, the way someone swats an insect, and that meant she had done it before many times to people who couldn't afford what it cost to report it. Her father's voice came then different from the porch in Chicago, more specific. The ones who are casual about it, those are the ones who've been protected. Find out who's protecting them. And Diane sat in the back of the SUV with her hands cuffed behind her and the taste of blood in her mouth and the absolute cold, precise intention of a trauma surgeon who had just decided that the most important thing she could do for the rest of this night was stay calm and remember everything. The East Harlan Detention Annex sat on a dead-end road 3 miles south of the county seat, a single-story concrete block building that had been constructed in the 1970s as a county maintenance facility and converted to law enforcement use when the main precinct ran out of holding space. And it had the particular aesthetic of a place that existed specifically because it was easier to do certain things somewhere without many cameras. Marcus's assessment upon entry was automatic and immediate: camera positions, blind spots, the distance from the holding cells to the rear exit, the number of staff visible, the layout of the booking area, the mental mapping that 14 years of operational work had made as automatic as breathing. And what the map told him was that this building was chosen for tonight for the same reason. Certain conversations happened in parking garages rather than offices. Not because it was convenient, but because it was quiet. Ben Collis was at this booking desk, 24, 8 months on the force. The uncertain posture of a young man who was becoming aware in real time that the gap between what he had been told law enforcement was and what he was watching law enforcement do was wider than he had prepared himself for. And Marcus watched him the way he watched junior personnel in every operational environment he had ever entered, which was carefully, because the junior ones were always the ones whose choices ended up mattering most. Diane was brought in separately, and when Marcus saw her across the booking area, he cataloged the 3 things that were different: the redness along her left jawline, the way she was holding her right arm slightly closer to her body than her left, and the quality of her controlled fury, which was different from the controlled fury she had been carrying since the initial stop. Harder, more specific, the fury of a woman who had something new to be furious about. They were placed in cells at opposite ends of a short corridor, and the doors closed, and Marcus sat on the metal bench and did what he had been doing all night, which was building the case in his head while waiting for the part of the plan that was already in motion 60 miles away in Memphis. The one phone call came 47 minutes after booking, which was a violation of Tennessee Code Annotated, Section 40-7-106, that Marcus was going to add to the list, and he took the cordless phone that Collis brought to the cell door and dialed from memory, not the Memphis field office main line, which would go to a switchboard and add 2 minutes he couldn't afford, but the direct desk number for ASAC Denise Carter, which he had memorized because situations like this were why you memorized things. She picked up on the second ring, and Marcus used the operational code word for his cover identity and then gave her everything in under 90 seconds current location, both in custody, marijuana, charge-fabricated body camera, deliberately inactive evidence planted during unsupervised trunk access. Diane physically handled during extraction and during transport, full details forthcoming when secure. Carter's response was 3 seconds of silence. Not the silence of someone who didn't know what to do, but the measured pause of a senior federal official who was running tactical calculations against procedural constraints in real time. And then she confirmed that the dashcam feed had been live from the moment the blue lights appeared, that Agent Thomas Rueda in Memphis had been watching the entire stop, and that the response timeline was 90 minutes from Marcus's call. There was one moment, brief, genuine, the kind of uncertainty that Marcus allowed himself when he was alone in a holding cell in a building with no good exits, where he sat with the phone in his hand after Carter disconnected and wondered whether the plan was solid enough, whether 90 minutes was short enough, whether the decision to maintain cover through everything that had happened to Diane was a decision that the case file would ultimately justify, or one that he would carry differently depending on how the night ended. He handed the phone back to Collis through the pass-through slot, thanked him quietly, and watched the young deputy's face as he walked away, the face of a man who was starting to understand that something in this building was wrong and hadn't yet decided what to do about the understanding. A gray Dodge sedan with no license plates pulled into the annex parking lot's blind spot at 10:41 p.m., the specific blind spot between the perimeter fence and the building's south wall that Marcus had identified during entry, the one that put a vehicle outside the field of the building's single exterior camera and sat with its engine running for 4 minutes before the driver's door opened. Derek Marsh was 26, white, former Army infantry, now employed by Volunteer Security, LLC, a private security company run by a retired Harlan County deputy named Gary Ellis, that existed as far as Operation Clear Road's supplemental reports could determine, primarily to provide the kind of services that law enforcement agencies occasionally required but preferred not to have on their official payroll. Marcus read him in the first 8 seconds. No badge, no nameplate, no radio, no handcuffs on his belt, but a concealed firearm under his left arm, military-issue Belleville 5.9 OS boots, that Marcus recognized because he had worn the same model during his first deployment, the specific gait of infantry training that distributed weight differently than civilian walking, and at the edge of his collar, partially visible, the dark ink of a unit tattoo, the kind that soldiers got at duty stations and wore for life. Ben Collis asked him for credentials when he entered the building, which was the correct thing to do, and Doyle cut him off with a single sentence and an order to take his break. And Marcus watched from his cell doorway as Collis's hand went toward his radio, and then came back down 3 seconds, the gap between instinct and obedience won, and the young deputy walked toward the break room with the heavy footsteps of a man who already knew he was making the wrong choice. Marsh walked the corridor to the cells with the room-scanning eyes of someone whose training had made threat assessment automatic, and when he stopped outside Marcus's cell, Marcus looked at him and understood from the description in 4 separate complainant statements in the Operation Clear Road file that he was looking at unknown subject 6, the young, quiet, military-looking man who had visited witnesses at their homes until complaints disappeared, and who had been in the case file for 4 months without a name or a face, and now had both. They were moved through the camera blind spot, Marcus first, Diane behind him, Marsh at the rear, and Marcus stated his objections aloud into the dark parking lot, clearly and in sequence: no transfer authorization, no receiving facility. Documented the individual providing escort was not a law enforcement officer and had not identified himself as one, and this was the 3rd documented use of force against a restrained person tonight. Fulton slammed him into the side of the Dodge, hands on his shoulders, full body weight behind it, the impact traveling through his shoulder blades and into his spine, and leaned close enough to deliver the message that a man delivered when he believed no one was watching and no record existed. Nobody's recording anything and nobody's going to hear you. Diane's voice came across the parking lot like a scalpel. Not screaming, not pleading, just the flat command of a woman who had spent 20 years in operating rooms where calm authority was the only acceptable register. And she told Fulton to take his hands off her husband, and the authority in it stopped him. Not because he respected her, but because the calculation changed when the performance had an audience, even an audience in handcuffs. Marcus looked at Diane across the dark space of the parking lot, and she looked back at him, and they made the decision together in the way that people make decisions when they have been married long enough that the decision doesn't require words. And they got in the car, not surrendering, not submitting, but choosing the version of this night that ended with both of them intact and the case file intact and 312 people with a shot at something that resembled justice. The Dodge pulled out of the lot without headlights, and Marcus began building the map in his head. Turns mile markers road surface the way the trees changed from managed to unmanaged as they moved further from developed land. All of it logged in the same mental structure he had used in Kandahar and in every operational environment since, because a map you build in your head is a map that nobody can take from you. The destination was a converted equipment shed on a rural property at the end of an unpaved road, a single-story, metal-roofed structure surrounded by the specific silence of land that had no neighbors within shouting distance. And when Marcus stepped out of the Dodge into the cold and looked at the building, he understood two things simultaneously: that this was infrastructure maintained and used regularly, and that it appeared in the county tax records under a shell company whose property tax payments traced back to a personal checking account belonging to Roy Tanner. Tanner arrived 20 minutes later in a white Ford F-150 with a department parking decal on the windshield, wearing civilian clothes and a departmental windbreaker that he had apparently grabbed on the way out the door. And he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had been elected 3 times by people who trusted him with their county and had spent those 3 terms building a version of that trust that looked legitimate from the outside and was something else entirely from the inside. He sat across from Marcus at the metal table, and his opening remarks were not about the marijuana charge or the stop or anything that had actually happened on Route 19. They were about leverage, the careful architecture of professional destruction, the threat of what the system could do to a person's life before a verdict ever arrived, the charges on record, the hospital notification, the licensing review, the name in the paper. All of it delivered in the casual voice of a man who had used this particular set of tools before and knew exactly how effectively they worked on people who had something to lose. And then the question that changed everything, delivered almost as an afterthought, almost as though Tanner expected it to be easy. What is a consultant doing, driving Route 19 every Saturday night for 6 months? Marcus recalibrated in the space between the question and his response because the question told him everything the case file had been unable to confirm, that the stop tonight was not random, not Craig Fulton freelancing on a Saturday shift, but targeted, directed the result of Roy Tanner having noticed a pattern on his highway and deciding to find out what it was, which meant the planted evidence and the fabricated alert and the annex, and this building were not a traffic stop gone wrong, but a coordinated interrogation, the entire machine engineered to get Marcus into this chair. He answered the question with something true and revealing. Nothing scenic. Drives officer, my wife and I enjoy weekend drives and watch Tanner's face process the response with the patient skepticism of a man who didn't believe it and didn't need to because he had other tools available. Deputy Ellis Fry, seated at a laptop at the far end of the table, had been running database checks throughout the conversation. Standard searches, name and vehicle, and address, and had found nothing which was exactly what Marcus's cover identity was designed to produce. And Tanner, unsatisfied, told Fry to go deeper to run the federal databases which required calling dispatch because the annex didn't have federal terminal access. Fry picked up his phone, dialed, waited. And somewhere in those seconds between the call being placed and the answer coming back, the investigation crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed because every search on a name flagged to an active federal operation triggered an automatic alert to the investigating agency. And Marcus's name was not just in the federal system. His name was the anchor of the system, the source credentials of Operation Clear Road itself. Fry's phone rang in his hand 60 seconds after the query was submitted, which was faster than a standard return because the flag on Marcus's name was set to priority response, and Fry answered it and listened, and his face changed in the way that faces changed when information arrived that rewrote everything a person had assumed about the situation they were standing in. The animation leaving his expression the way color left skin when blood retreated to protect the core. He lowered the phone and looked at Tanner, and the 6 words he said, "Sheriff, the FBI is asking where he is," were the last 6 words of Roy Tanner's career as an elected official. Though Tanner didn't know that yet because the engines weren't audible through the building's metal walls until 4 minutes later, when the question of what Marcus Webb was doing on Route 19 every Saturday night was about to answer itself in a way that no one in that building except Marcus had seen coming. The sound arrived before the lights engines. Multiple vehicles, the particular acoustic signature of large SUVs moving at speed on an unpaved road, growing louder with the inexorable approach of something that had been set in motion 6 months ago and could not be stopped now. And Marcus sat in his chair and let the sound happen without changing his expression, because the expression of a man who knew the cavalry was coming was the first confirmation that something had gone wrong for everyone else in the room. 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans came through the gate in formation, high beams flooding the clearing with white light that hit the metal walls of the building like a second sunrise, and their doors opened before they had fully stopped. Federal agents in dark tactical gear, moving with the synchronized efficiency of people who had rehearsed this exact approach and knew exactly what they were coming into. ASAC. Denise Carter stepped through the door of the converted shed at 11:22 p.m., and she did not rush, did not announce, did not raise her voice. She simply walked into the room with the particular authority of a woman who had spent 27 years with the Bureau, learning that presence was more effective than volume, that the gold badge on her lanyard said. Everything that words would only repeat, and her eyes found Marcus in the first 2 seconds and read him the way a field agent read a returning operative, checking for injuries, reading the situation, confirming identity, all in the space of a single steady look. Her first words to Roy Tanner were delivered at normal conversational volume and carried the full weight of the federal government in every syllable. "Remove your hand from my agent and Tanner's hand." Opened finger by finger, the way a man released something he had only just understood was burning him, and he took 2 steps backward with the unsteady gait of someone whose legs were receiving the news before the rest of him. She removed Marcus's cuffs with a key produced from her windbreaker pocket, and the metal falling away from his wrists brought the immediate flood of circulation that was almost more painful than the restriction itself, the deep red indentations already bruising on both sides. And then she moved to Diane, same key, same deliberate removal. And when Diane's wrists came free, Carter looked at the swelling on the right wrist, the abrasion along the inside of the forearm, the redness along the left jawline, and she looked at Doyle, who was standing against the wall, and her expression did not change, but something behind it became very, very cold. Diane's damage report was delivered in the voice she used for surgical findings, not a victim's testimony, but a physician's inventory. Contusions, both wrists possible, sprain, right hand, bruising on the forearm, consistent with 4-finger grip during forced extraction, and an open-handed facial strike delivered by Lieutenant Karen Doyle during transport, hard enough to draw blood. And Carter turned to the agent at the door and said, "Photograph everything before treatment chain of custody starts now," and it started. Marcus reached into the left interior pocket of his jacket and removed the credential case that had been pressed against his ribs for the 4 hours and 17 minutes since Craig Fulton had first hit the lights on Route 19, and he opened it, the gold badge catching the overhead bulb's light, the laminated photo ID clear and unambiguous, and held it up the way credentials were held during official actions, angled so that the badge and the photograph and the printed identification were all simultaneously visible. Supervisory Special Agent Marcus A. Webb, Federal Bureau of Investigation Civil Rights Division, Memphis Field Office, Lead Investigator Operation Clear Road. He looked directly at Roy Tanner when he said it and watched the collapse happen in real time. Not dramatic, because the real thing never was just the slow unwinding of a man whose certainty had been the foundation of everything he had built, and who was now watching that foundation reveal itself to be hollow. And Tanner's mouth opened and opened again, the specific verbal failure of a person whose brain was producing responses faster than his voice could manage them. You cannot. I need to see verification. Anyone can buy a badge at, and Carter stepped forward and produced the federal warrant signed by Judge Patricia Harmon, U.S. District Court, Middle District of Tennessee, and handed it to Tanner with the flat efficiency of someone delivering a document that was going to do what it was going to do regardless of whether the recipient was ready for it. Marsh was cuffed against the wall, the Glock recovered from under his left arm, the filed serial number confirmed by the agent who bagged it, a federal felony under 18 U.S.C. Section 922K added to everything else. And he said nothing, his face showing nothing, the trained stillness of a man who understood that the only move available to him now was silence, and he would maintain that silence through every subsequent proceeding with the discipline of someone who had been prepared for exactly this possibility. Fry moved toward the door with the incremental retreat of a man who hoped that slow enough meant unnoticed, and got 3 feet from the exit before an agent's palm appeared against the frame. "Deputy, I need you to stay in the building." And Fry stopped and looked back into the room where Roy Tanner was reading a federal warrant with both hands, the paper trembling slightly, and decided that the door wasn't going anywhere worth going. Carter's team arrived at the East Harland Annex at 11:38 p.m. and found it exactly as Marcus had described Fulton in the rear parking lot finishing a cigarette with the casual posture of a man who believed the night had gone according to plan. Doyle at the booking desk, composing the incident report that would have become the official record of what had happened if federal intervention had arrived 30 minutes later, and Ben Collis in the break room with his head in his hands and his phone face down on the table beside him. Fulton's Miranda was delivered in the parking lot by Agent Carmen Torres. Every word of it unhurried the constitutional guarantee spoken aloud for the benefit of a man who had spent 16 years deciding which people deserved its protection, and the cuffs went on with the same mechanism, the same cold metal, the same ratcheting sound that Fulton had applied to 200 and some pairs of wrists in his career, and his face showed the specific recognition of a man experiencing the system he had weaponized against others now completing its circuit back to him. Doyle was arrested at the booking desk, her composure holding through the initial approach and the initial advisement and most of the reading of the warrant, and then Torres said, "We have medical photographs of Dr. Webb's injuries, including documentation of the facial impact sustained during transport," and the composure developed a hairline fracture at the corner of her left eye, barely visible. But there the first honest thing her face had done all night. In the break room, Torres sat across from Ben Collis with a different posture and a different voice than she had used in the parking lot, because Collis was not a subject, he was potentially the most important witness in the case. The insider whose testimony would connect Craig Fulton's Saturday night performances to Karen Doyle's supervision to Roy Tanner's direction, and what he needed from her right now was not authority, but the particular kind of honesty that made telling the truth feel less costly than staying silent. He told her about Marsh, no credentials, no radio, the way he moved the 3 seconds where Collis's hand had gone toward his radio and come back down, and Torres listened without interrupting. And when he finished, he said, 3 seconds. I keep thinking about 3 seconds, and Torres looked at him and said, 3 seconds in the wrong direction ends careers. 3 seconds in the right direction saves lives. You still have a chance to use yours. And he gave her everything, holding nothing back, the full testimony of a young man choosing belatedly but completely the side he had always believed he was on. They sat together in the back of Carter's Suburban on the drive to Memphis. No partition between them and the agent driving, no handcuffs, no cage, just the highway and the hum of the engine and the particular silence of two people who had been through something together and hadn't yet found the words that were equal to it. 40 minutes in with the Memphis, still an hour away. Diane spoke, and she told him about the car, about Doyle's slap, not as a report, but as something she had been carrying since it happened, and was ready to put down somewhere. He could see it, the cold, the shock, the silence afterward. That was worse than the blow. Her father's voice arriving from a porch in Chicago 15 years ago with instructions for exactly this situation, and the loneliness of sitting in the back of a patrol car and understanding that the man who could have stopped it had chosen not to. "You were holding a badge that could have stopped it," she said, and her voice was not accusing. It was exact, the precision of a surgeon identifying a finding, stating it clearly. Because stating it clearly was the only way to address it. And I need you to sit with that, not because you were wrong about the case, but because I was in that car. Marcus did not defend himself, did not explain, did not reach for the operational logic that made the decision correct, because she already knew the operational logic, and the operational logic was not what she was asking him to sit with. She was asking him to sit with the cost, which was different. And he said, "I will. I would make the same decision, and I will spend the rest of my life understanding what that cost you," and those were the only honest things he had available. Neither of them spoke for 20 miles, and then Diane reached across the space between them and took his hand. Not forgiveness, not entirely, not yet, but contact the decision to stay in the same car as the reckoning, instead of turning away from it. And the highway lights passed overhead like a slow count, regular and indifferent and beautiful. And the road ahead was clear. Craig Fulton pleaded guilty to 2 federal counts: deprivation of rights under color of law and evidence tampering within 3 months of his arrest, the union abandoning him within a week when his personnel file became public and revealed 23 prior complaints that the department had protected him from, and the recommended sentence of 36 to 48 months was accompanied by permanent loss of law enforcement certification, which meant that whatever Craig Fulton did with the years after prison, he would not do it with a badge. Karen Doyle pleaded guilty to conspiracy, 24 to 30 months recommended, and her attorney pursued a victim reconciliation program as a mitigation strategy, an outreach to Diane through a third party, a scripted apology. The suggestion that acknowledgement of harm was a form of accountability, and Diane's response was delivered through her own attorney. In a single sentence, "I don't need her apology. I need her department to stop hitting people in the back of patrol cars." Sandra Pruitt was charged with conspiracy for fabricating the radio alert, her own voice in the recordings becoming the prosecution's clearest evidence against her. Roy Tanner was indicted on 6 counts, including conspiracy and civil rights violations, resigned his position before the indictment became public. His pension placed on administrative hold, pending the outcome of federal proceedings, and a federal consent decree was signed, placing the Harlan County Sheriff's Office under federal oversight for a minimum of 5 years. Mandatory reforms, independent monitors, civilian oversight with real authority, quarterly data reporting that would make the numbers visible before they hardened into patterns, and Ben Collis testified fully in every proceeding, kept his badge transferred to a different department, and began the slow work of becoming the kind of officer he had told himself he already was. It was a Tuesday evening in late July when Diane brought the envelope to the back porch, a manila folder from the Federal Victim Witness Coordinator, thick with paper, and she set it on the table between their chairs without opening it. And they sat with it for a moment, the way you sat with things that were important enough to approach slowly. Marcus held it and didn't open it immediately because the weight of what was inside was not the weight of paper. It was the weight of 19 people. 19 of the 312 who had agreed to provide impact statements for the sentencing hearings. 19 individuals whose names had been entries in a case file for months and who had just become, by the act of signing a statement, something that a case file couldn't fully hold, and he sat with the transition from data point to person for a moment before he was ready to open it. Diane asked the honest question, will it actually change anything? The oversight, the reforms, will it hold? And Marcus gave her the honest answer, the one that 14 years had taught him. was the only answer worth giving, that the monitoring would catch the obvious violations, that the data reporting would make patterns visible before they calcified, that the oversight board would give community members a seat at a table they had never had. But the thing that made Fulton believe he could plant evidence on a black man and face nothing that doesn't change with a consent decree that changes in a generation, maybe two. If the people inside the system decide the cost of not changing is finally higher than the cost of being honest. And she nodded and reached across and took his hand, and they sat in the July heat with the magnolia tree blooming white in the yard, and the envelope open between them, and the names of 19 people who had decided to speak. 1 month after the consent decree was signed, Marcus drove Route 19 alone. Not under cover, not in the Honda, not with a case file running in his head, just a man in a bureau vehicle on a late afternoon in August when the sun was still high enough to turn the fields on both sides of the road golden, and the drive had no purpose except the purpose he was giving it. He pulled onto the shoulder at mile marker 22, cut the engine, and sat, not documenting, not recording, not building anything, just sitting with the stretch of road where the blue lights had appeared, and with the 312 people who had driven this highway before him and been stopped and searched and charged, and some of them harmed, and all of them sent home carrying something they hadn't been carrying when they left. And he let the number be people for a minute instead of a statistic. The landscape had healed. The gravel was smooth. The grass grown back where Diane's surgical bag had spilled the tire marks from Fulton's cruiser, long absorbed by the ordinary traffic of an ordinary county road, and Marcus started the car and pulled back onto Route 19 and drove north, and in the rearview mirror the highway receded behind him, looking like every other road in Tennessee. 2 lanes farmland on both sides. The indifferent beauty of a landscape that didn't carry the record of what had happened on it, except that the record existed, was documented, was on file in a federal court in the Middle District of Tennessee. And that was the thing that hadn't been true for 312 people until 6 months of Saturday night drives had made it true. On a Sunday morning in August, Marcus and Diane sat at their kitchen table in Memphis with coffee and the newspaper folded to the front page. Federal Consent Decree, signed Harlan County Sheriff's Office. Under federal oversight for minimum 5 years and the magnolia tree. Diane had planted the year they moved in was visible through the kitchen window. White flowers, heavy in the summer air. The same tree she had looked at from this table on Saturday mornings for 7 years. She read the headline, set the paper down, looked at her right wrist, the bruising long faded, the swelling gone. The skin smooth again, and then she looked up and asked him the question that had been waiting since the car ride home, the one that was not about the case or the charges or the consent decree, but about her. Was I a part of this? Or was I just in the car? Marcus set down his coffee and looked at her. Really looked at her the way you looked at someone you had been married to for 12 years and still found surprising, and said, "You were never just in the car." The moment Doyle hit you and you stayed calm and cataloged everything, instead of breaking, you became evidence that a consent decree couldn't ignore. 312 people have federal oversight tonight, partly because of what you survived in the back of that patrol car and chose to remember instead of bury. Diane was quiet for a moment, absorbing it, not looking for comfort, but for truth. And then she looked out the window at the magnolia tree and picked up her coffee and said, "The thing that ended the story the right way. Then it was worth it. It still cost too much, and it was worth it. Some things are both. And that is what justice looks like from the inside, not clean, not complete, not without cost, but real and documented and finally irrevocably on the record." If this story moved you, if you saw something in Marcus and Diane that felt true, something in the 312 that felt familiar, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next one. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever been in a situation where staying silent felt like the only safe choice? Your story matters. We're listening.